We're going to be talking today about the implicit association test, the most famous test, I would say, of unconscious bias, particularly racial or gender bias. And you may have heard of the IAT, not necessarily by that name, but you may have heard it referenced because in all of these conversations that our society has been having about sexism in the tech world or about racism among police officers in the last few years, people often reference the IAT as evidence that, look, even if you don't feel consciously biased in your views of women or minorities, that doesn't mean you aren't. And in fact, most people have these unconscious biases against these groups, which the IAT can reveal. So it's been in the public discourse a lot, probably more than almost any other social psychology instrument. However, as researchers and journalists have been scrutinizing the IAT a little more closely, and the evidence that it's measuring something real and meaningful, well, it looks like these results might not be as solid as they seemed, which is where Jesse comes in. Jesse wrote a piece for New York Magazine that was sort of one of my favorites of his articles about just going really in depth into the evidence for the IAT and some of the problems with that evidence and the interpretations of it in popular discourse. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Jesse, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I disagree that I am statistically literate, but I appreciate the compliment.
Oh, well, you do a convincing impression of statistical literacy. Which,
thank you very much.
The closer that gets to being perfectly convincing, the less distinguishable it is from actually being statistically literate.
Yeah, exactly.
Jesse, let's just start at the beginning. Can you just describe what the implicit association test is? Like, when you sit down to take it, what are you doing? How does it work?
Yeah, so in the most basic version of the IAT, you sit down at a computer and you're shown sort of a series of images and words that flash quickly. So some of the words will be negative, some will be positive. You might have, illness as a negative word, happiness as a positive word. And those are interspersed with images of black faces and white faces. This is one version of the test and the most important version of the test. And you're basically asked if you see a good word or a white face, hit the letter, say, E on your keyboard. If you see a bad word or a black face, hit the letter I. And those two combinations are flipped at a certain point. And what's going on under the hood is the computer is tracking how easily you connect in your brain. This is the thought, at least, good concepts with white faces versus good concepts with black faces, or bad concepts with white faces versus bad concepts with black faces. The idea is if it takes you longer to connect, say, black faces with good concepts, that means your brain is sort of struggling more and trying to overcome implicit bias. It means according to the test, that is a sign that you are implicitly biased in a way that would favor white people over black people. And of course, the test could also reveal that you have an unconscious preference for black people over white people, but the data they've collected suggests most Americans have an unconscious preference for white faces over black faces, or, in other versions of the test, it might be white sounding names over black sounding names and so on.
Right. And what have the results generally shown? Like, how do people tend to perform on the test?
The average American is implicitly biased against black people. It's funny, even just describing these results, you need to be very careful because, as we'll get into,
we'll definitely get into that.
Yeah. So, right, that is the sort of layperson or version, or what the proponents of the test would say, is that the average American is implicitly biased against black people, and that is more common among white test takers than black test takers, but a solid minority of even black test takers are also implicitly biased against their own race.
Cool. So let's just start by digging into the interpretation of the IAT. So reading your article and some other things I've been reading after your article has been really helpful, but I have to admit that when I first heard that the IAT might not actually be evidence of bias, my thought was like, I agree that just because someone gets this score in this test, that isn't identical to them actually being racist. It's just their score on a test. So it's not proof, but it was really pretty hard for me to come up with a plausible story in which someone would have this, unconscious association between white faces and good concepts, or between black faces and bad concepts, and not actually be biased. So maybe you could just talk about other ways to interpret the results.
Yeah. So the most common alternative explanation, and this has been posed in the literature a lot by several different researchers, excuse me, is basically that if you're aware of negative stereotypes about black people, you might be quicker to associate words like crime with black faces, or, victim or violence with black faces. If that's the case, then that could generate a high score, meaning a bias score on the IIT, even though you're not implicitly biased against black people, you're just aware of these, negative stereotypes against them. And there was one particularly ingenious experiment in which researchers actually created a new non-existent, you could call it either a race or a species, called Noffians, Noffians. And by sort of inducing in the experiment's participants this idea that Noffians are this sort of downtrodden group that society doesn't like, they were able to
Inducing how? Just like reading them paragraphs about Noffians being bad, or?
Yeah, so basically what they did was there are two groups, the Noffians and the Facites. And so sometimes they would basically tell people Noffians are privileged and Facites are oppressed. Other times it would be the reverse. When Noffians were oppressed, for example, people would score a higher IAT about Noffians.
So more bias, more what we would have naively assumed was bias against Noffians.
Yeah, exactly.
But obviously they can't actually have any reason to think Noffians are bad because they're a made-up group, and all we know is that they've been oppressed.
Right, exactly. So that was what was so ingenious about the experiment, is in this case, there was no other explanation but that, if you view a group as downtrodden, it might boost your IAT score regarding that group.
Right. I guess in theory you could have a story, it's kind of convoluted, but you could have a story in which you have some belief that oppressed groups are oppressed for good reason. And so if a group is oppressed, then there must be something bad about them or something.
Yeah. Well, there's all
sort of hard to falsify that.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's the thing. We're talking about, in some cases, a difference in reaction time of a couple hundred milliseconds. So if you have a pie that is 200 milliseconds, how big a slice of the pie is actual implicit bias? How big is associations? How big is just problems with the way the test is designed or with error? And the basic problem is that people have assumed the whole pie, or most of it, is something that we can genuinely call implicit bias against a group. And the studies trying to connect IAT scores to actual behavior in a lab setting simply haven't really shown that.
How do they try to connect it to, do you mean to actual, to behavior that we would call biased behavior?
Yeah.
They're trying to connect that to people's score on the IAT?
Yeah, so there have been, by now, a lot of studies where you basically give people the IAT, and then it sounds weird, but you put them in a lab and you give them an opportunity to be a little bit discriminatory. And that can take a lot of different forms. One of them is you sort of give people a chance to interact with a white or a black experiment confederate, and you might find that people with high IAT scores are ruder to someone who's black than someone who's white, as judged by a third-party observer. That's one example.
A third-party observer who doesn't know their score on the IAT?
Yeah, a third-party observer who's blinded to the whole sort of experiment.
Interesting.
So, for a while, the test first came out in 98. The first study showing this sort of result, showing that it was linked to behavior, came out in 2001. And then for, a decade and a half, there were all these other studies that appeared to show this link between IAT scores and behavior. And the test two creators and main proponents, Masrin Banaji, she's the head of psychology at Harvard, and Anthony Greenwald, who's another big name in social psychology, they said, look, these are incredible results that show this test can predict behavior better than just about anything else, including situations where you explicitly ask people about their levels of racism. And what researchers have found is their claim doesn't hold up. When you actually take all these studies together and do a rigorous meta-analysis, IIT scores really only explain a tiny chunk of the variation in how racist people act in these experiments.
Do people's results on the IIT correlate with their explicit self-reported bias? Like if you just ask them questions about their beliefs about Black and white people, does that connect to their score on the IIT?
My understanding is that there's I think a fairly weak correlation there. By now they've correlated IIT scores with things like political party, for example. So I think there's a fairly strong connection where the higher you score on the IIT, the more likely you are to be politically conservative.
It seems like kind of indirect evidence for its, for whether it's measuring something, the thing that it claims to be measuring.
There are so many sort of potential confounds here. And part of the problem is a lot of these experiments were not, at least according to Hart Blanton, who's sort of one of the smartest critics of the IT literature, he doesn't think even the experiments that do show a correlation were designed in a sufficiently rigorous way. And that's a view that was echoed by a couple of Scandinavian researchers who looked at the evidence and basically said, whatever correlation we find in the landscape of IIT behavior literature, it's just so statistically weak, we really can't assume anything to be true here.
Got it. So probably we should separate these two distinct questions about whether the IIT is a good test that actually demonstrates implicit bias. Where the first question is, like, were these studies well conducted? Like, if you were to try and replicate this exact phenomenon of people, showing a stronger association between white faces and good concepts than between Black faces and good concepts, would those studies replicate, like, as opposed to just being noise or, a poorly designed study, et cetera? But then second, let's say that the answer to the first question is yes, they were well-designed studies, it's a real phenomenon. Then the question is sort of, what does that tell us? Does that have any relation to the things we actually care about, like people making biased choices or behaving in biased ways? I guess these two different questions kind of map onto internal validity and external validity. Does that sound right to you, that those are the two questions?
Yeah, and I think those are the questions. And I think where we're at now is that there are consistent patterns in the IIT data where, for example, white people score higher than Black people on the Black-white IIT, meaning they score higher, score as more biased. And
so that has replicated.
Yeah.
This association exists and that it's higher among white people.
Yep. That stuff is, my sense is that stuff is fairly solid in that even the critics will say, okay, this is a genuine pattern, this is worth investigating.
Yeah.
What has not held up is the external validity. And we should go back in a minute and talk, there's other internal validity issues, but in terms of the basic external validity question of, does the IIT predict behavior meaningfully? At this point, the answer really appears to be no, to the point where even, Brian Nozick, who's a big reproducibility guy and who was involved in a lot of this research, his name is on a paper. I'm not sure if it's out yet or if it's in press, but the most recent sophisticated meta-analysis showed that IIT scores account for less than 1% of the variance in racist behavior in lab settings. So,
oh, wow.
In what other situation, if someone came to you with this fancy new instrument and said, check this out, this is really important, we should spend millions of dollars on it, and you said, okay, how good a job does it do explaining what we're trying to measure? And they said, under 1%. There's just no situation in which you would find that impressive. So to me, the external validity question really doesn't look good at this point, or the answer to that question doesn't look good.
Yeah. I did indeed want to talk a bit about the internal validity problems too. So, why don't you tell us what some of the problems are with how with actually measuring the pattern? Yeah.
So you do get these consistent patterns at the big zoomed out level, especially in terms of how white people versus Black people perform on the test. The test is quite poor when it comes to what's known as retest reliability.
Like if the same person takes the test multiple times, do they get the similar scores?
Their score will jump around quite a bit. Yeah. And I think if they're white, it's likely that most of those scores will be positive, meaning in theory it indicates they're biased. But my article has sort of the nitty-gritty statistical stuff, but basically this does not this test does not come close to the level of test-retest reliability we would expect for any instrument professionally used to measure anxiety, depression, or anything else. And the reason why it sort of blew up the way it did and became this viral sensation, despite performing so poorly in terms of its psychometric attributes, is an important question. And I wish we had a better sense of why that is, but it just doesn't come close to the level of performance one would expect.
Yeah. Thinking more about how it could be the case that the pattern is real, but it doesn't actually translate into biased behavior. Someone, I think it was a philosopher, but I'm blanking on his name now, said that it seems to them what matters isn't whether people have an association between, say, the concept of Black people and the concept of, bad or dangerous. What matters is how central the concept dangerous is to their conception of Blackness. Because if it's not central, then it can easily be swamped by other contextual associations. I think the example they gave was, if dangerousness is central to your concept of Blackness, then you're going to associate that with a Black person no matter what context you view them in, almost. Like whether you see a Black person in a church or a university or a street corner. But if dangerousness is just very kind of secondary or peripheral to your concept of Blackness, then maybe you'll associate a Black person with dangerousness in some contexts like a street corner, but as soon as the context switches to, say, a church or a university, there's no longer that association for you at all. And so the IAT, it's this very abstract kind of contrived, it's really contextless. So it doesn't really measure the centrality or the context dependence of the associations that it's testing for. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think what's striking is the way that even though all we're measuring is this very slight fraction of a second, in many cases, reaction time difference. And the folks who created this test and then helped publicize it and wrote a big book about it simply stated, in my opinion, without evidence, that this test could explain everything from police shootings to, problems in terms of who gets to rent what home. And they've basically said this test can explain a big chunk of racism in the U.S. And I just don't think that claim is merited by the evidence at all. And I think all the focus on the IAT has potentially sucked a little bit of the oxygen out of the room and diverted funding and attention from other, better or more rigorous ways of understanding race from a social psychological perspective.
Yeah. One really important point that I want to make sure comes across in this conversation is that so let's just assume that the IAT is completely bullshit. That would not imply that there's no such thing as implicit bias, right? It just means this one test that was designed to measure implicit bias is not a good test. And in fact, personally, I would be shocked if there is no such thing as implicit bias. Like all of my priors and a bunch of anecdotal evidence suggests to me that there is. And by priors, I mean, we know that a ton of cognition is unconscious. We know we're influenced by patterns that we're unconsciously picking up or that we think we're picking up, or our brain is picking up without being aware of it. And there has been plenty of stereotyping by race or gender in our culture historically. So I would expect that to influence our unconscious pattern matching algorithms, and maybe the fact that it feels like such a common sense thing to exist is why the test has been why people have sort of overplayed the evidence for this test, because on some level they're like, oh, well, this just makes so much sense, it must be true. And they don't worry too much about the fine details of the evidence.
Yeah. And you're touching on one of the frustrations about trying to write about this in a rigorous way, which is when you point out the weaknesses of the test, you sort of get two annoying responses, one from each side of the political aisle, to oversimplify a little bit.
It's like the story of your life on Twitter, Jesse.
Yeah.
I'm really impressed by the equal amounts of vitriol you get from both sides.
Yeah, which I find weird because I really do consider myself pretty far to the left, at least by
I also would consider yourself in an American context, you seem pretty clearly on the left to me, but
yeah. But so you write an article like this and people on the left will say, oh, so you're saying implicit bias isn't real, you're saying racism is an important thing to study, which right. No, I'm not saying that. And then people on the right will say, Well, this clearly shows that the focus on implicit bias is misplaced, because this shows implicit bias isn't real. When in fact, as you just said, this is just one instrument. If I gave you a thermometer and you show that the thermometer doesn't do a good job measuring temperature, you would not infer from that temperature isn't an important thing to measure, or temperature doesn't exist. And the evidence for implicit bias, I think there's a fair amount of solid empirical evidence for it. When you look at, for example, studies where they send out a bunch of job applications with stereotypically black versus white names, there is this consistent pattern where if you have a white name, having a white name grants you sort of a bonus in the probability you'll be granted an interview. And that, to me, sending resumes out in the 21st century when we know people claim not to have explicit bias, that to me is fairly solid evidence for implicit bias.
Yeah. It's also a little more, I know it's a test and not, it's actually an in the field real test. Like, people think they're actually deciding who to hire, right?
Yeah. And
so, that seems like much more direct evidence of what we care about than the IAT.
I would say so. People should look up the work of, I took a class with her. Her name's Diva Pager, Devah. She's done some of these resume studies, as have a lot of other academics. And yeah, you could tell some sort of pretzel-like story where, that's actually explicit bias, but they're hiding it, and no one can observe them, so they act as it. But to me, as you said, it's just implicit bias. Everything we know about sort of system 1 versus system 2 processing and the way humans really carve people up into categories, I absolutely think implicit bias is real, that in some settings it probably matters a lot. I also think what's happened over the last 2 decades in social psychology is that this one very faulty test has convinced people that implicit bias is probably the thing to study to understand racial discrepancies, when in reality, there's all sorts of deeply rooted structural stuff going on that doesn't really rely on implicit bias to reproduce these inequalities, to use the sort of lefty sociological language. Right.
I guess now that we're talking about these more meaningful and fruitful tests of implicit bias, like the resume studies, I guess I'm wondering what is the value add of an IAT? Like, even if it, I guess, okay, if we want to test people for implicit bias, why don't we just give them resume tests, for example? And I know that, we couldn't just give them a single resume and infer their level of implicit bias from that, because it's the bias there would be measured over a set of resumes. You'd have to look at, whether on average they show bias against black named resumes. But you could do that. You could just give people, 20 resumes to evaluate, some of which have black names and some of which have white names, and you would randomize, the name and see how they evaluate them and if they show a correlation. Or you could give them, a pretend court case with a defendant who's either black or white and ask, do you think this person is guilty, or what kind of sentence do you think they should get? And over 20 of these, you could then see if people are harsher or like less forgiving of black defendants than white defendants. Why aren't we just doing that? That's so much more direct.
I think, well, for one thing, the IAT, you can sit down and take it in about 10 minutes. Like, it's very simple and straightforward to take.
Yeah.
I also think that the proponents of the test would claim it's measuring something a bit more sort of primal, or at like a really basic cognitive level that isn't captured by a more sort of the more intellectual system 2 process of sitting down and evaluating resumes and evidence.
I see.
This is where stuff gets really complicated, because if you talk about a hiring manager looking carefully at different resumes, how much are they influenced by system 1 thinking versus system 2 thinking? How can you even answer that question empirically? The nice thing about the IAT, if you think it works, is it really boils things down to gut impulse system 1 thinking, and it doesn't let other factors creep in, again, in theory.
All right. So let's say it's true that to some extent implicit associations predict bias. And I hear you that the evidence is pretty shaky on that, but let's just assume it were true. Does that mean, or would that mean that if we wanted to get people to act in a less biased way, that the right approach would be to to change those associations, like get them to start reassociating Black and white people so they are more likely to associate Black people with good instead of bad, and that would cause them then to behave in a less biased way. What do you think of that connection? It's like jumping from prediction, using this as prediction to, assuming a causal connection. Yeah, gotcha. Exactly.
I would say, again, we're in now a fantasy world where the test does predict something meaningful. There's still no evidence that you can actually attack these associations and change them. There's now been, I'm less versed in this research, but there have now been a number of studies attempting to build interventions that basically do what you just said, which is sort of try to rewire people's associations. And that big meta-analysis I mentioned that Nozick is a co-author on, the main thing it was looking at was the effectiveness of these interventions. And I have a quote in my article here, basically from Calvin Lai, who's this Harvard, I think he's a postdoc, who worked on that study. And he basically said, we found no reason to believe that these interventions work, that they do what they're advertised to do. And, I don't find that surprising because the test isn't really measuring anything in the first place. But even if you assume it is, there's still no evidence that this is the most useful use of inevitably limited resources to try to fight racism.
Right. Are there versions of the IAT on topics other than race that hold up better, like that are more stable, have more, what did you call it, test retest? Well, I was just going to ask if there are versions of the IAT that score better on that metric and are also more predictive of real world behavior. Like what about IAT for gender instead of race?
Right. The gender one is, if anything, weirder because it fairly consistently finds that women are more implicitly biased against women than men are. It gives all these weird results that we're supposed to take at face value. So I'm looking at this chart, and it basically shows that white women have the highest level of implicit bias, and any kind of man, white men, Black men, Hispanic men, are less implicitly biased when it comes to gender.
Meaning that they're less likely, they seem to have less of an association, an implicit association between female faces or names with concept like good? Or what is the actual association they were testing for?
Yeah, this is basically, this is the compilation of everything they ask on all the tests that were taken on Project Implicit. I'd have to actually go back and see how they frame this. It's basically just reported as implicit gender bias, which we can take safely to mean just that men are better than women or better qualified for certain positions than women.
Right.
So in this view, it varies a little bit depending on how liberal or conservative you are, but generally speaking, all women are more biased than all men, more implicitly biased. Now,
do the men show any bias, or is it just not distinguishable from zero?
They show some bias, yeah. It looks like a moderate amount of bias. So what the IIT asks us to do is accept this version of reality where women are just consistently and significantly more implicitly biased against women than men are, which, like, implicit bias is this sort of sometimes fuzzy and woolly concept where, you could have bias against yourself, you could have all these weird societal factors, but I'm just not sure why we should accept this idea that women are significantly, across the political spectrum, more biased against women than men. And what's funny is, I'm looking at this now, even strongly liberal women, they're more implicitly biased against women than far, far right men. So think about that for a minute.
Wait,
yeah. I
was sort of skeptical when you were saying that women showed more bias against women than men, because I was like, well, like if there's a culturally dominant stereotype about what women are good at or bad at, I wouldn't necessarily expect women to buy into that less than men. And so it wasn't shocking to me that women would show more of this bias. But I mean, the like strong liberal versus strong conservative, that goes against all of my common sense about gender bias.
Yeah. So this is what I'm sort of saying. Like when I wrote this article, this is a second article, I was responding to a 538 piece by a very talented reporter who reported these associations at face value, and I don't think he was skeptical enough. So to me, these tests aren't magical. Researchers aren't infallible. You're telling me that a far left woman is more implicitly biased against women than Jerry Falwell Jr. Right. I mean, should we? I guess there's some version, and maybe I'd be more likely to believe it if this test had shown, that it was ready for prime time in terms of all the psychometric properties. But I just find that to be a very hard result to believe.
Yeah. This almost makes me wonder, how easy is the IAT to game? Like, could it be the case, for example, that far-right men are like, these liberal researchers are trying to like prove that people are sexist. I'll show them, and I'll just like, associate women with all the, career-minded words or whatever. Right.
So one of the big selling points of the test, especially I think in its earlier days, was that you can't really game it, that it's sort of this like computer algorithm truth serum that reveals your deepest beliefs.
I really do see why this became so beloved by the public. Like, it's such a sexy idea for a test. It's
so compelling. Yeah. And I want to circle back to some of the sort of political ramifications for liberals, but the test proponents have not told a consistent story over whether or not these are impulses we can control or whether or not it can be gamed. And you can see that a little bit. I'm not sure these two ideas are entirely contradictory. Maybe you tell me. So on one hand, you have the idea this test is revealing something about ourselves we can't control. It can't be gamed. Then on the other hand, you have, but there are these interventions that can reduce it, that can fix it. I guess you could sort of see those two ideas.
Those don't seem contradictory to me.
Gotcha. So you're saying like maybe if you make a conscious effort to fix them, then you can?
Yeah. I mean, you can make them, reconcile them with each other by just saying, well, you can't hide, like taking this test, you can't hide your current level of bias. That's going to come out. But that doesn't mean you can't change your level of bias over time.
Gotcha.
Basically. Yeah. That's how I read it anyway.
I retract. That part's not that contradictory. I guess where they have been contradictory is different researchers at different times have made different claims over to what extent in one test taking session you can control your results or game it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. So let's talk about you were alluding to the political implications of these results for liberals in particular.
Yeah. So I'm basically working on a book about sort of shoddy ideas in social science and why they catch on and what they can tell us about society. And my IAT chapter is going to be in some regards similar to the article I wrote, just talking about the methodological issues. But I'm also interested in the way that, in a way that might sound strange, I think this test tells white liberals a story they want to hear. And I'm including myself in that because I'm very much white and very much a liberal. There's something about the experience of taking this test that can make white liberals feel like they are taking part in the fight against racism. Despite, I'll try to be gentle, but oftentimes white liberals don't really do much but take the IAT or tweet about racial injustice. And oftentimes, because of the crappy system that we have set up, we are perpetuating many of these forms of inequality. I think the IAT might give us an easy way out to feel like we're fighting the good fight without actually doing anything. That's my
I really appreciated this part in your article where you were talking. I think it was your article where you were talking about the kind of performative nature of these of people reporting their scores on the IAT. There's just sort of this ritual that people seem to go through of reporting their score with this like really sort of troubled self kind of emotional tone, almost like a confessional. This wasn't your phrasing, but it reminded me of some of the like circles in the early 70s, like at Esalen or something, where people were sort of like confessing their sins to the group in this really emotional way, almost like exercising their, bigoted demons or something.
Yeah, there's this sort of for some people who take the test, not just white people, but mostly white people for understandable reasons, there is this sense of like, this sin within me has been discovered and I can expurgate it by telling people about it and by telling people about how I responded to this test emotionally. And it's just striking because the test doesn't really do anything. I mean, as I would argue we now know now, and it's just sort of another way, in my view, for white liberals to talk about caring about this stuff without actually putting their money where their mouth is. And
well, I want to stick up a little bit for the white liberals.
Sure.
If I imagine this test actually measuring a real thing and being reliable and so on, then it does seem, it's not the most like high effort or costly thing you can do, but still seems pretty valuable for people to post their results and say like, turns out actually I'm biased too. Because it kind of helps with the story of like, racism is real, and just because you think you're not a racist doesn't mean you're not acting in a way that hurts minorities or something. So that does seem, well, I guess I could also tell the opposite story. This is something that I talked about in my previous episode with Seth Stevens-Davidowitz, which is that like, it's not clear that making it common knowledge that everyone's racist is actually helpful. It certainly seems plausible it could be, but you could also tell this other story where like, it just normalizes racism, and then everyone's like, oh, well, I guess if everyone's racist, then it's fine for me to be racist, and it makes it seem more acceptable. So I don't actually know, but at least I could tell a plausible story in which this would be a valuable thing for white liberals to do in a world in which the IIT was measuring something real and meaningful. It's a lot of qualifications, but
sure. Yeah, no, and I appreciate your impulse because I do think overall, anything you can do to sort of interrogate your own role in propping up racism or propping up any bad institution is good. I just think the performative aspect of this, and B, the extent to which it just isn't anchored to anything in the real world, which again is something the average test taker doesn't know. It seems to me that it just doesn't get us anywhere. It's just more white people talking about how dismayed they are at their own racism without then. I don't find IAT conversations tend to lead to discussions about what to do. I think it leaves people maybe feeling a little bit helpless. And I think from I'm not an activist, but I think it's safe to say, like, psychologically, if you make people feel helpless or mad at themselves, that isn't necessarily the best way to then get them to actually do something about it.
Yeah, it also, and this is another good point you raised in the article, it also strikes me as kind of unethical to keep giving people this test that tells them that they're biased without necessarily good evidence for that. Because as you say, it can be kind of psychologically harmful, or it's an unpleasant thing to have to believe about yourself. And it's ironic because the IRB, what's it called? Institutional Review Board, the board that's supposed to like prevent unethical studies from being done and make sure that, participants are being treated well and they have informed consent and they're debriefed and all these things. And like, in so many cases, the IRB just, dramatically overreaches and bogs down like completely harmless studies in like months of red tape. And that's maddening. And yet at the same time, stuff like this happens that like actually does seem harmful and somehow slip through the cracks. I don't really understand how this works.
Yeah, did you see the Scott Alexander piece?
Yes, that's what
I think that everyone's been talking about.
We should link to that.
Yeah, on Slate Star Codex, his blog, he has a great piece about navigating the incredibly Byzantine IRB process. But this is another point I hope I can go deeper into in the chapter. Brian Nosek, who I have a lot of respect for, when I asked him about this, he said, if my 5th grade daughter gets a bad grade on a math test, it's just one piece of information. She should fit into her broader understanding of how good she is at math. And he compared that to the IAT. I don't think that comparison works because since the test was created, so many people who have taken it, including the co-founders, talked about the searing nature of the emotional experience of getting your test result and finding out that you're biased. So it's very clear that taking this test has a big emotional impact on some people. So what's another situation in which we would be okay with a psychological test being promoted by Harvard eliciting in people this sort of reaction, despite the fact that it isn't clear what exactly, if anything, it's measuring. If Harvard was offering an anxiety or depression test that had these psychometric properties and that caused people to get really upset, there would be rightfully some serious ethical questions about that test. And I don't know. I guess summing it all up, racism is just such a tricky, emotional subject, and we so desperately want easy answers about how to address it that I think our desire for those answers swamps some of our other more thoughtful impulses, maybe.